Yes, let's get started. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm very delighted to open today's session on the evolution of Earth system law, innovating new legal principles for the Anthropocene. So my name is Rak Kim. I have the pleasure of serving as a co-convener of the Taskforce on Earth system law. Today's session is dedicated to a major project currently underway within our task force, a book edited by Professor Louis Kotze. It's one of the most significant initiatives for the task force on Earth system law at the moment. And Louis, as the chair of the session, today's session has kindly asked me to say a few words about the task force, especially for those who are new. So the Taskforce on Earth System Law is a subgroup within the Earth System Governance Network. We bring together researchers from diverse backgrounds who focuses on the legal challenges of the Anthropocene, particularly those that emerge from an Earth system perspective. We now have more than 100 members, and we continue to grow. The leadership team consists of Louis Kotze, Mike Engstead, and myself as co-conveners, with Ushik Girgic managing our task force. We've also had the great support of Catherine Blanchard, who has served as a co-convener for several years. And I'm happy to also say that we have benefited immensely from the guidance of an advisory group that we have, some of whom are here with us today. So the task force has been around for now 7 to 8 years. It emerged out of the need for a new legal principle, a new framework to address the challenges of the Anthropocene. We are proud to say that our members have successfully sparked the debates around this crucial topic. If you search for Earth System Law as a phrase on Google Scholar, you will find over 700 publications that mention the term. The growth is especially remarkable in recent years. So, for example, just this year in 2024, we've seen over 150 new publications in this field. We also are thrilled to see more early career scholars identifying themselves as Earth system lawyers. For instance, one of our members, Daniel Akrofi at the University of Lincoln, is finishing his PhD thesis titled Earth System Law as a New Innovative Legal Imaginary for Global Plastic Governance. At the University of Geneva, we also have our member, Rahel Zimmermann, working on the final chapters of her PhD thesis, provisionally titled Moving International Environmental Law into a New Era, Earth System Law and Transformative Change. So this growing body of work has even reached legal practice. At a recent conference in Indonesia, where Louis was invited to speak, the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court praised Earth system law as a foundation for the radical legal innovations needed in our time. In 2021 and 2022, Louis, Catherine, and I co-edited a special issue on Earth system law in the Earth System Governance Journal, and it brought together 9 contributions from 27 scholars, and it closed by inviting many others to join this ongoing effort to construct a new legal paradigm for the Anthropocene. We are now excited to present the next major project, the research output, the edited volume led by Louis. And today's session, as you know, will feature presentations showcasing the latest thinking on Earth system law. And I'm looking forward to hearing these contributions. Thank you very much. And over to you, Louis.
Thank you very much, Rak, for that very generous and very concise update and introduction. We are obviously extremely delighted to be all present here. Thank you very much for the panelists who've made the time to be here. Thank you also to all of the attendees, certainly, for taking the time and sharing this conversation with us. And that is really the aim of the next couple of minutes, is for this to be a conversation. As Rak has said, we've started with this book project, looking a bit more critically and I dare to say radically at the emerging discussions about Earth system law. And we've drawn on really an amazing set of people to contribute to this, people that I have had the pleasure of working with for over many, many years. Also some new colleagues who have really sparked my interest. I see that Mike Leach, for example, is here, who's done some amazing work. It's really been a pleasure. The book is moving forward fairly quickly, and we hope to submit the manuscript rather soon. And what we want to do today is obviously also we do want to share with you what we have been doing with the book, but it's not only about sort of a book promotion. It's too early for that. We do want to share with you some thoughts about our thinking, about where the debate could go as it manifests within the manuscript. And we warmly invite everyone also to engage with us in a discussion around this book and the ideas that we are developing in it. And certainly also we would love to hear how you are thinking of taking your own work further and how you can see the larger agenda of Earth system law sort of developing further. I do not want to spend too much time saying anything around the general outlines. What I do want to get to now specifically is this book project. And I think what sort of sparked us to do it is the idea that Earth system law was, as many of you would know, first proposed in 2019 by Ruck and me in a publication. And at that stage, we, as Ruck has mentioned, we intended to offer just an alternative way of thinking about the law in the Anthropocene. And we think that the extent to which Earth system law presents a new vision of law in and for the Anthropocene, it certainly urges a critical reflection upon law in an Earth system context, thereby attempting to disrupt the sort of foundational assumption of conventional environmental law. And I know that Mike Leach certainly will have something to say about this, as he has also done so in a very critical but constructive way in some of his other publications. We think that this paradigm shift that we want to achieve with the vision of Earth system law includes considering how law could better respond to Earth system transformations, the sort of external transformations caused by, among others, climate change, extreme weather events, and so forth, geopolitical conflicts, but also how law itself must transform internally to better govern or be able to govern the socio-ecological aspects of Earth system transformations. And this is also a sort of a sub-project that Rak and I are still busy with, is sort of taking, mapping the field of Earth system law and taking sort of a bird's eye view of the scholarship. And when one surveys the key publications focusing on Earth system law, there are several sort of general ideas that emerge within the current scholarship. And I can briefly just summarize these. It is mainly about Earth system law discarding a sort of a reductionist focus on the environment as its primary concern in favor of embracing a much more broader, holistic, deeper understanding of planet-wide Earth system transformations, and these transformations as a governable domain. The discourse of Earth system law, of course, acknowledges the expansion of the human enterprise from very localized areas to really the highest all-encapsulating planetary level, although we also emphasize the importance of downscaling and upscaling as well, as the broader Earth system governance agenda does. Earth system law departs from this assumption that the regulatory institutions created within the Holocene context might not all be suitable, in their present form at least, to govern the sort of unique challenges emanating within the Anthropocene context. And that's also why the discourse on Earth system law really foregrounds Anthropocene complexity as opposed to Holocene stability, by recognizing the sort of combination and interplay of hyperconnectivity, nonlinear dynamics, directional change, emergent properties of the Earth system, many which we still don't understand. And this is all usefully done by Earth system disruptors, and we see it through in these contexts such as climate change. I think another important point is that Earth system law sort of rejects this dichotomy between humans and nature that reduces inherent systems complexity, and that also sort of dumps down the debate and turns us away from a consideration of ethics and ethical principles, something that many of the authors in this current volume and also some of those here present will say something about today. And that's basically, I think, where the debate currently is. So what this book really tries to do, and I am going to try and share my screen, is just to show you a little bit of the structure. Rak, can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Excellent. So what the aim of the book really is to offer a first consolidated sort of in-depth reflection on Earth system law, the state of the art, and all of the emerging concepts and ideas around Earth system law. It also reflects on the identification and the design of, among other things, but also certainly principles that could inform the development of Earth system law. And the argument here is a little bit that principles like polluter pays, sustainable development, precautionary approach, and so forth, were instrumental many years ago in shaping international environmental law. And they might also play a decisively important role in shaping the contours or the direction, if not the precise content, of Earth system law. That's also why we want to reflect on principles a bit more broadly. Throughout this book exercise, we would also like to try and identify future research themes and pathways for Earth system law research. And this would be, hopefully, the first comprehensive book in the CUP Earth System Governance series, specifically reflecting on the legal aspects of Earth system governance in the form of Earth system law. So in a nutshell, the book is really ultimately concerned with initiating and stimulating new thinking about the role of law and legal science in social, epistemic, and broader governance spaces and processes that must address Earth system transformations and promote planetary integrity, or you can also say global sustainability. So the book is divided in 5 parts, of course, an introduction. And as with all introductions, this one must still be written. Then there is a part on resituating the debate on law, legal principles, and planet Earth. Another part involving alternative worldviews and new ethics, shaping the evolution of Earth system law. Really, really rich contributions there as well. And then a fascinating part, sort of breaking open the often traditional closures of law and legal science, of thinking innovatively about Earth system lawyering and governance, and then, of course, a conclusion. So as I said, chapter 1 really would want to take a sort of a broad view of the emergence of Earth system law, mapping the field, seeing where the research is, what sort of broader research themes have been picked up up until this date. Chapter 2 will focus specifically on the role of principles in undergirding a new legal paradigm, and also briefly reflects on what sort of principles do we need. Is the principle of polluter pays still sufficient to address the sort of the planetary problems that we deal with at larger and smaller scales? Or do we need new principles? Do we need the principle of vulnerability, of reflexivity, of sufficiency, for example? Mike will also say something now, certainly about principles of Earth system law that he approaches from a much more critical perspective, and a fascinating one, certainly. I'll leave it to him. Chapter 4 is Earth system law and the praxis of being deprincipled, a provocative title, certainly. where Emile Belot, Laura May, and Sean Sellers really grapple with the idea of, do we also need principles, and what type of legal principles do we need for Earth system law? In the part of alternative worldviews, we try to engage more critically and radically, even sometimes, with alternative epistemologies, ethical principles, ontologies even. Karen Morrow, who's also here with us today, will say something about the need for a new ethical relationship to underpin Earth system law for the Anthropocene. Jeff and Ivan will say something about the fascinating new area of territories of life. Michelle Lim has sent us a presentation, and that's also a fascinating chapter on stain guarding Earth system law in the Anthropocene, rather provocative title. Rosalind Warner is here to speak about kingship as a metaphor for Earth system law and governance. Peter Burden, our colleague from Australia, reflects on ecological integrity as a possible alternative worldview. And then we come to these sort of chapters that really, really look beyond the trite confines of what we've been doing to date within the discussions about Earth system law. Cameron Holly, Clifford Shearing, Samantha Moyo speak about the architectural principles of Earth system law. Mike, who's also present here, will speak about the near frontier and institutional pathways to Earth system law. Benoit, who we are also very happy to have here, a climate law specialist by training, but also certainly able to venture very, very well into other domains, has a chapter called The Earth System Lawmakers, which he will say something about. Ben Richardson from Tasmania focuses on film and the sort of impact that the film industry and Netflix short series, for example, have on environmental consciousness, and he very cleverly links that with the discourse on Earth system law. Frederick Hanush, who sadly couldn't be here with us today, speaks about the United Times, sort of taking a look forward in time, a chronopolitan thought experiment in planetary law. And then, of course, we've got our conclusion, which all still need to be written. So that's basically the broader outline of the book. I hope I could sort of whet your appetite for the book itself, and also for the discussion that will start right now. And I'm very, very happy to ask Mike Leach to say something about his chapter. Mike, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. There, can you hear me? Okay. Still, even since the pandemic, this whole muted, unmuted thing, we haven't figured that out. It's unbelievable. Anyway, so thank you very much to the organizers for putting on this forum and this opportunity to discuss this really interesting and important collection. Thanks, Louis, for inviting me to this session, but also for you and Rack and the others to bring this whole project together. And thanks for those that are attending as well. Yeah, really happy to be here. So when Louis first proposed this idea of Earth systems law being organized or being driven by principles, my first thought was to ask, what exactly are these things called principles? And where would an ESL principle come from? So methodologically, what I do in this chapter is I cast my gaze backwards to ask, where do legal principles come from in general, in order to ask where and how ESL or systems law principles might emerge in law in the future. So I wrote a piece that's called Past Reflections on the Future Origins of Earth Systems Law Principles, which kind of ties with the sort of the time conundrum of Anthropocene and Earth Systems Law writing in general. But before I get into a few details about the chapter, and I know this is only 5 minutes, I promise. I've timed it, so it'll be short. I promise, Louis, no problem. But before I get into the details of the chapter, I just want to point out that there might be two ways to talk about principles here. And the first way is to talk about Earth systems law principles as normative guideposts or frameworks within which scholars like us might structure our own discussions about this intellectual field or project that we call Earth systems law. In that sense, such principles would come from our own scholarly decisions and choices about what should be in and what should fall outside of this pretty big and open tent called Earth systems law. So easy, no problem there. We can do what we like. No question really where these principles come from. But the other way to think about Earth systems law principles is to imagine them as actual prospective principles of law. And some of the visionary thinking that Earth systems law scholars have done so far is to critique present legal structures by imagining how law, usually international law, might or could be framed in the future around concepts like the Earth system. And it's in this latter sense of Earth systems law as a body of legal principles that caught my attention because it begged a certain question to me of whether principles of law, or systems law or otherwise, ever really emerge from scholarly meetings like this. And the answer is not really. And so the question then is, well, where do they come from? And so what I did in this paper was I cast my gaze backwards by looking at three principles of international environmental law: the precautionary principle, the prevention principle, and the polluter pays principle, to ask how did principles like these emerge on the international stage to begin with, and what does that tell us about the potential future for Earth systems law as a collection of legal principles? And what I found was that none of these three principles really became principles of international environmental law because groups of smart scholars thought that they were a good idea for the environment or good ways to change or to deal with climate change. Rather, they emerged as principles in international law at very specific moments when lawmakers and treaty negotiators needed ways to more easily deal with the mundane features of state practice and state interaction that were being challenged in new and novel and problematic ways that were complicating their ordinary work and behavior. So the polluter pays principle was created to better manage trade. It first emerged in international treaties as a mechanism to clear up trade imbalances that had arisen between Western countries that were caused by different domestic policies of paying for pollution cleanup. The prevention principle emerged to resolve relations between sovereign states it emerged out of arbitration jurisprudence as a solution to the problem of states needing to manage their relations in the face of activities that were causing transboundary environmental harms. The precautionary principle emerged to resolve collective action problems in the context of scientific uncertainty, or more specifically, the sort of increasing scientific awareness of environmental damage and climate change over the past decades created problems for states to figure out among themselves what constitutes appropriate action that they could mutually sort of permit each other to do in the face of great scientific uncertainty. So if we treat these three international environmental law principles as representative, and they're not the only ones out there, but just for this is sort of a thought experiment, this chapter. If we see them as representatives, then the point here is really that legal principles emerge at moments when there is a demand for solutions to new and unfamiliar conundrums of ordinary state behavior and interaction. And those don't necessarily emerge out of normative projects to rework legal frameworks. So the main takeaways, and I'm just getting to the takeaways here for this chapter, just to wrap it up, is that we can take from this for Earth systems laws to really speak to certain types of questions for future work. So in Louis' introduction, you'd like, so where would this research, what would be next steps and things like this? So the first one would be like to recognize that international legal principles emerge as mechanisms of law at times when there is a demand for them on the international legal stage, not necessarily always when scholars think they're good ideas. And that demand arises when international legal actors are confronting new problems that complicate the ordinary and mundane work of states and international organizations. And so this begs a question to me of what those future circumstances would have to be whereby international legal actors, especially states, would want or feel a need to turn to Earth systems law or the concept of the Earth system in search of a solution. In other words, what kind of context would the ordinary and mundane practices of states and international organizations be challenged or problematized so much or to such an extent that they would need to turn to Earth systems law principles to fix or resolve them? How fertile might the Earth system as a concept be for translation and adaptation to resolve multiple legal conundrums facing states in this Anthropocenic era of climate change. How might the Earth system help states better manage their ordinary relations with one another in this era? Where would this demand come from? So I don't speculate. This is just, I'll finish this last sentence. I don't speculate on what those conditions are going to be or what those questions are. There's only so much room in a chapter, of course, to do this. And I'm just a lawyer, so I'm not really equipped as some of our Earth Systems governance colleagues are to really consider those socio-political and economic contexts that might produce this sort of demand for a particular kind of legal principle. So in that sense, my contribution in this collection is really a modest invitation, I think, to a bridge maybe, to a greater collaboration with our system governance colleagues who are better equipped to talk about and speculate on these questions of state behavior and practices, and this question of where does state demand for principles like our systems law come from? And I'll stop there. So,
thank you very, very much, Mike. That was brilliant. Vintage Mike Leach, brilliant. Thank you so much. Very thought-provoking. I also encourage you to read Mike's publication in Earth System Governance, where he also engages very critically with the concept of Earth System law. Fascinating read. And certainly a very worthwhile invitation. And that is also what we aim to do in the book, possibly not only to provide answers, which is not the business that we are in, but also to raise more questions and sketch out further lines of research and to contemplate where will the Earth System laws be made and how will it be made? Who will be interested in it? Perhaps no one is, perhaps some might be. And these are the sort of questions that we want to tease out. So thank you very much, Mike. Really appreciate it. I'm going to go over to Louise Dutoy, who has also been extremely active as part of our task force and who has published also widely on the issue of Earth System law from the University of Southampton. Louise is co-authoring one of the chapters with me on the emergence of new principles, the need for new principles. Louise, I would very much appreciate it if you can share some general thoughts on the chapter with us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much, Louis. So in a nutshell, the chapter considers existing principles of environmental law, such as polluter pays, the principle of state sovereignty over natural resources and sustainable development. It questions the effectiveness and continued appropriateness of such principles in this new context marked by significant Earth system transformations, and it tentatively proposes new principles that may be better fit for purpose. So going into more detail, the chapter first provides a brief overview of legal principles generally. So it considers the role of legal principles. For example, while principles are not legally binding, they are nevertheless important for several reasons, and we go into these reasons in the chapter. And this includes, in the words of Bodansky, that they articulate collective aspirations, and they may also guide or influence environmental governance. The chapter argues that environmental law, which is supported by principles, has failed to restrain humans and prevent Earth system harms. And while some principles might be criticized simply for being politically inoffensive or not especially effective, others, such as the principle of sustainable development, which is foundational to environmental law, have arguably facilitated and legitimated such Earth system harms, including through prioritizing economic development over environmental protection. And we go into more detail on this in the chapter. And we do recognize that these criticisms do not apply equally to all principles. For example, the precautionary principle played an important role in the global ozone regime. And here parties took a precautionary approach to address potential ozone depletion, and they did this before harm had actually been observed outside of the laboratory, and despite resistance, including from industry. But despite some exceptions, we suggest that many environmental law principles are no longer appropriate, nor able to effectively respond to complex Earth system governance challenges. And we begin to think about new principles that may be more appropriate. And we refer to the conceptual framework of Earth system law that was set out in the 2019 paper by Kotze and Kim, that officially introduced the concept of Earth system law, and we use this framework to guide our thinking in identifying possible principles. And some potential candidates include respect, responsibility, interconnectedness, restoration, sufficiency, and restraint. And in the chapter, we say a bit about what each principle might mean. We also suggest that some of these principles are already beginning to be reflected in some more recent multilateral environmental agreements, such as the 2015 Paris Agreement and the 2023 BBNJ Agreement. That's the Agreement on the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So, for example, the BBNJ Agreement recognizes interconnections between, on the one hand, biodiversity loss and the degradation of ocean systems, and on the other hand, warming due to climate change, ocean acidification, and pollution. And the BBNJ Agreement also reflects parties' desire to act as stewards of the ocean and refers to protecting and caring for the marine environment. It's also notable that explicit references to the sovereign rights of states over their own resources, which are contained in earlier multilateral environmental agreements, are absent in the 2015 Paris Agreement and the BBNJ Agreement. So in light of the recognition of some of these principles in more recent multilateral environmental agreements, we argue that there's possibly more openness to such alternative principles now. And we also highlight that some of these principles are already reflected in the laws of certain countries that recognize the rights of nature or Mother Earth. As one example, Ecuador's constitution specifically recognizes the right of nature, or Pachamama, to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. And even beyond the legal field, there's been recognition of the limits of growth and GDP, including by the UN General Assembly and by the OECD. And while more work will be needed to elaborate on these specific principles, as well as the categories into which they fall, it's our hope that these principles, or principles like these, could contribute to the ongoing development of Earth system law and also guide approaches to better response to Earth system transformations.
Thank you very much, Louise, for such a absolutely crisp and concise summary of the paper, of the chapter rather. It will be interesting how it will be received, and perhaps it's also something that we can discuss as we take this conversation forward. What sort of principles do we need for the Anthropocene, and how can they be embedded within the conceptual framework of Earth system law? I want to move on to the wonderful Karen Morrow, longtime friend, partner in crime, and someone who has pushed my thinking about law generally, law and sustainability. And that is why I was extremely eager also to ask Karen to come on board this project and to help us push the boundaries about thinking about the law, with the law and with others, about where we can take this. Karen, please, thank you very much.
Okay, let me just put my timer on, because otherwise I will not stick to time, because there's so much to say about this. Thank you, Louis and Rak, for asking me to be part of the project, and thanks to everyone for being here and for your wonderful and interesting ideas, which I'm sure are much more interesting than mine. I suppose there are lots of ways we could think about this, and I started off by thinking about this from an ecofeminist perspective, and really founding my consideration on what the ethical relationship between various elements of humanity and between humanity and the Earth actually is. So how do we get where we are now, and how does that need to change for us to go forward as a species? And one of the things that I said very firmly one of the last times we met, Louis, was that international law is not global law, and it's certainly not Earth system law. It is not the vehicle that actually helps us to deal with the idea of thinking about the planet as a planet. It's the Lord of the Flies in legal form, isn't it? Every man for himself. And I think that international law, as we currently see it, can't possibly deliver what we need to have an approach to how we relate to each other and how we relate to the planet that actually takes into account the idea that we are in relation with each other. So I was looking at the idea of feminist analysis of the relationship between humanity and the environment, Val Plumwood, and her idea of the paradigm of mastery, the idea that the environment is there to be exploited, to be othered, for us to flourish at the environment's expense, but also for certain privileged humans to flourish at the expense of others. And that served a very small amount of, or a proportion of humanity very well for a very long time, until now it doesn't. The paradigm of mastery, I think, is actually the illusion of mastery. We don't master the planet at all. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is about the Anthropocene and what it means to be a planet-making and a planet-breaking species for humanity, and how that means we need to think about what it is to be human, and also what it is to be human in relation with the world that we rely on to survive. And thinking about that relationality, I suppose I thought about two dimensions of the ethical choices that we make. One is the need to think as a species for humanity in terms of justice and equity in the here and now, but also the idea of future humans, future generations. That can't be a nation state level concern. That is a concern for all of humanity. It is an Earth system, planetary level concern that we don't think about well at this point. And having read the Declaration for the Future, we still don't think well about it, even in the stuff that's supposed to be setting the agenda going forward. It's a deeply disappointing document in many ways. It's sort of lukewarm rehash of where we've already been, and there's no new thinking there of the sort that we need to be talking about to actually shift that ethical view of how we view ourselves and positioning humanity with the idea of a future in mind, and a sustainable and decent future for us and for the planet. The two aren't separable, in my view. So I had to think about Carol Gilligan's work and the ethics of care, and that's amusing for me because it's something I've been looking at from different perspectives for many years, until very recently everybody would look at you and go, what's that? Why are you talking about this? Now suddenly everybody wants to talk about the ethics of care, but very few people seem to understand how it might look if we used it in the context of the sorts of Earth system problems that we're talking about here and now. And it does not translate easily or literally in any shape, form or fashion to something that can be used in that context. But its values and its relational thinking, to my mind, actually do provide ways that we can actually look at this relational view of what it means to be human, vis-a-vis other humans and vis-a-vis the Earth. And I've thought about it in terms of what I'm calling the 3 R's for the Anthropocene in my notes, rather than in the chapter, but just to help me remember what these things are. And the 3 R's for the Anthropocene in many ways overlap with what Louis and Louise are talking about, I think, in that I would see a care-based relational ethic, wow, that's gone quickly, a care-based relational ethic as being humble to start with. It's an ethic of humility, but in terms of the 3 R's, it's responsible. We made the Anthropocene. We are the only species who can in any way act to engage with and hopefully ameliorate it. Relational, what we do in the Anthropocene affects humanity here and now in very different ways. Humanity going forward in the future, if we have a future, depends on our ability to engage with this, and the planet. The planet will go on without us, quite happily, but differently. We are the species making the Anthropocene. We are the species most at threat from it in many ways. Other species will be, but life itself will go on without us quite happily. And that brings me to my 3rd R. We need to be responsive to the issues that we thought. And I've concluded my chapter by having a look at something that interests me in terms of no harm prevention type ethics, and comparing a relational view of no harm drawn from the Hippocratic Oath with an exploitational idea of no harm drawn from human practice and sustainable development, where we say no harm and we do lots of harm. An exploitative ethical background for that is where the difference lies between a care-based or relational no harm in medicine. And I looked at questions of geoengineering, specifically with regard to some ice cap-based projects that are being discussed, glacial geoengineering being at least brought off a discussion by the University of Chicago. And that scares, I'll go to the Irish vernacular, the living bejesus out of me for many reasons, because if we act with regard to something like geoengineering the way we have done in the past, that is a pathway to disaster. I suspect that, and I don't think it's a good idea, but I suspect we will see geoengineering of various sorts being used as we get more desperate, as the Anthropocene really gets its claws into our Earth systems. And if we're going to do that, we really need to think about that from the point of view of a relational ethic in terms of the interests of all humanity, not just the privileged few or the companies who think it's great to experiment on us all, and the planet. And I would suggest that a relational ethic there should actually take a first do no harm approach to a relational approach to what it is to be human in the Anthropocene and what it is to relate to each other and the Earth in light of the Anthropocene. I think that's it.
Wonderful, Karen. Thank you so very much. Very powerful message in a very short period of time. And certainly your sort of focus also on solar geoengineering is something that you will know several of the members of the Earth System Governance Network are interested in and have written about. So I'm sure that will also spark some interest, considerable interest. Thank you very, very much for that. Very much appreciated. Now over to Jeff Carver and Ivan Vargas. Jeff, I think you mentioned you want to go first, and then we hand over to Ivan.
Yeah, thank you, Louis, so much, and great to see you all. It's wonderful to be part of this book and to have had this to be working with Ivan on it. I'm going to give an overview, and then Ivan is going to drill down a little on what we mean here. So our chapter uses the concept of territories of life to frame a long-term vision and objective for Earth system law. And this really is a vision that is ultimately post-growth, post-capitalist, and decolonial. So territories of life are defined by the ICC Consortium as territories or areas in which a custodian, indigenous people or local community is self-governing the territory in a way that preserves, conserves the ecosystems that they live in, and also provides good lives for people. So our big vision here is, why don't we envision all of Earth as made up entirely of territories of life? So why this framing? First of all, it responds to how dominant legal systems today are largely a consequence of the coevolution of capitalism and colonialism over the past 600 years, which results in territory being seen as private property or other forms of property to be exploited for profit and accumulation. The result is that you have the persistent creation of sacrifice zones, where territories and the people and life support systems they rely on are sacrificed to what is held sacred, economic growth and profit. It also responds to the ecological crisis reflected by the planetary boundaries, and it responds to concerns that monocultures, both material and maybe more importantly, conceptual monocultures, render socio-ecological systems that they're part of vulnerable to deterioration and collapse. So the vision of Earth made up of territories of life is a vision of diverse and pluralistic legal systems that are co-equal, so non-hierarchical, and that are place-based, but interconnected up to the global level. So there's a lot of meat to put on those bones, but a central idea is that diversity and plurality are antidotes to our destructive dominant legal systems, and foster the kind of ecological resiliency that will be essential going forward. Just as we also in here try to sort out a little the connections between Earth system law, ecological law, Earth jurisprudence, and other formulations. So that was sort of an interesting exercise. I want to say this also echoes, little plug here, if I can, not going to be able to get that up there. So we have a book coming out this week, Ecological on Practice. I commend that to you, and we'll have an event on that. Ivan added so much richness in explaining how this works within a particular territory of life. So I'll turn it over to Ivan.
Well, thank you so very much, Jeff and Louis, for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here and to be able to connect with this wonderful network and some potential collaborations around place-based approach to law and more ethnographic approaches to this question of Earth system law. So let me just share the screen. We are actually talking about the territory. I want to bring the territory into the conversation, if I may, by sharing some images of the place where we work. And if I can do that, let me just quickly do that. All right, I hope you can see the screen. All right, excellent. So, so as Jeff was saying, this chapter focuses on one aspect of what we can define as a global socio-ecological conundrum. So the way in which the modern capitalist, colonialist complexes treat territory and life systems attached to it as private property. So this is sort of the main sort of assessment of what we're confronted with. And the term sacrifice zone becomes a very important conceptual framework for this kind of premise. So let me just go quickly to what I want to present to you. Jeff already have discussed the notion of territories of life, and I want to sort of center this conversation around the notion of territory as kinship, as indigenous Inga communities I work with define the territory, particularly how they define the territory as a cognitive and sentient self that offers some legal cues for us to understand this moment in law, actually. And then I want to talk about quickly about a vision for a law that is beyond the human, based on this notion of territories as cognitive and sentient, and suggest that we engage with a cosmological opening to law that might be of interest for the purposes of our systems law as well. So as Jeb was saying, the expression territories of life stands for territories and areas governed, managed, and conserved by custodians and indigenous communities, as defined by the CCI consortium. So we are asking actually, how can humans co-learn to co-create knowledge with living territories to live well together? How can indigenous experiences with territory actually reshape or even displace conventional decision-making protocols that rely on rational deliberation among humans alone? And along with that, how can the territories of life, this notion, this important framing, actually influence conceptions of law and help us design a law for a planet where the sentient properties of life are actually, and the cognitive properties of life are actually taken into account in our governance framings. So answering these questions actually help us lead an understanding of how the territories of life concept, which is rooted on local level place-based law, can actually anchor key aspects of what we are calling local to global Earth systems law. So this is the region of Caquetá, the Fragua River. I wanted to bring that to the conversation. So for the ICCA consortium, as we said, territories of life actually vary across cultural contexts and might also be defined or referred to as commons, greens, ancestral domains, country, community conserved areas, autonomous community, territorios de vida, lugares sagrados or sacred life, sites, etc., etc. So although these concepts refer to site-specific territories of life experiences, they all share an intimate material and spiritual, if I may, interconnection between communities and the territories they are part of. And this is a very important aspect of this conversation, the notion that territories are not also material assemblages, but also for these communities, they hold a spiritual dimension. And this is also in line of this relational framing that can actually become a legal principle, if you think about it, this notion of radical interdependence of the material and or quantum, if you will, and spiritual-like properties of a territory. So hence this notion of a cosmological opening, if you will. So as I said, all these notions of territories of life share this material and also spiritual interconnection. And this interconnection goes far beyond any linguistic representation to encompass what we can define as a meshwork of lively relations that are in constant coemergence. So you cannot sort of define the territory as a matter of human description alone. So this is a very important aspect of that. So in the living and in the Andean Amazonian territories of southern Colombia, Quechua-speaking communities of the Inga descent actually define the territory as a socio-ecological family. The territory is a kinship, as well as a meeting place, a place of encounter. So it is a place where life ways meet and cross each other, forming what Inga scholar Taita Hernando Chindoy define as a living tapestry, as a meshwork of life ways, if you want to bring environmental anthropology into the conversation. So for example, winding rivers, growing plants, roaming animals and humans, and even language are all ways of life or trajectories of growth and movement that are relentlessly coemerging together, as Inga leader Hernando Chindoy puts it, quote, all the plants, the leaves and the trees, and between them and the soil, there are many connections. We humans destroy these relations, these connections in times of deep separation and socio-ecological crisis. It is important to reconnect with the forgotten principle that teaches that all forms of life are sentient and family. So the vision of territories of life across Earth includes a broad acceptance of legal plurality, and this is sort of a very important tenet of our conversation. I'm aware that I'm running out of time, so I just want to end by saying that a law beyond the human is actually based on the recognition of these sentient and cognitive affordances of the territory as the basis of climate governance and environmental governance. And we have discussed the need for grounding and defining principles for this kind of conversation. And I think a crucial principle of this is a plural understanding of territories in these sort of material and spiritual-like dimensions as the territories as are defined by communities, not only in Colombia, but in many other places around the world. So much more to say, but this is just as a way to understand sort of the commonalities of different territories and as defined by communities, and the importance of paying attention to how communities define their relationship with territory as part of the framing in what we are calling local to global territories of life and Earth systems jurisprudence, if you will. So thank you very much for your time and appreciate the opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ivan. Thank you very much, Jeff, for this powerful reframing that you offer us. And I can assure everyone that once you get sort of your hands dirty in the detail of the chapter, it is as exciting as the proposals that we've just heard. And massive congratulations also on your book that's being launched. Please feel free to share a link if you have in the chat function. That will also be open to the audience and to the rest of us here. We would really very much like to see that. Thank you so much. So now we move to dear colleague and friend also, Michelle Lim. Michelle, welcome. I suspect it's a fairly brutal hour for you.
I'm actually in Trondheim, so it's
okay. No, there are no sympathies, so it's all good. But thank you so much for being here, Michelle. And I have read earlier iterations of her chapter, and it was absolutely enlightening, really, experience for me. The way that she writes, how she writes, the things that she writes about. And very, very happy that you are here to talk about your chapter, which is somewhat provocatively titled. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Louis. And before I start, I want to make a critical observation. So writing the chapter was a really nice opportunity to have a conversation with Louis' scholarship. And the observation I want to make is I'm touched at how I'm continuing to echo that conversation on a sartorial level, in case you didn't notice, and in our hairstyles as well. And that's probably the most profound comment I'll make for the entirety of today. And the title that Louis was alluding to, my chapter is called Stain Guarding Earth System Law in the Anthropocene. Back to the future for sustainable development. Some of you may be familiar with the term Anthropocene, Anthropification. Anthropification was the American Dialect Society 2023 Word of the Year, both terms coined by Cory Doctorow. And essentially, it's an observation of what's going on in the digital space, how platforms have become the middlemen of the internet. So platforms being things like Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, where initially these platforms are good to their users, us. But because of the networks that are created through these platforms, the platforms seek to monetize what's going on, an originally good thing, and therefore the platform turns to shit. Case in point being Twitter, bought by Elon Musk, and then turned to X, turned to shit. So the Anthropocene comes about because, as Dr. Rowe observes, everything is being Anthropified. So the Anthropocene is, and Zamori's work would also make the same observation, looking at some of the drivers of the Anthropocene, would be thinking, well, isn't this just neoliberalism? And Dr. Rowe doesn't refer to neoliberalism much at all when talking about what he's observing in the digital space. And that's what I want to extend this conversation to. So sustainable development comes in, building very much on Louis's work and the work of Sam Alderman, Felix Dubé, in looking at how and what Louise just talked about just then, how sustainable development has been enshittified because it's been corrupted, co-opted by neoliberal forces. And also linking to the discussion that all of you have presented in the context of this chapter, what happens if you come up with the best, most appropriate principles for Earth system law, and they too get corrupted and enshittified? So there's discussion in the chapter about, well, how did sustainable development get to that point? Are there perhaps lessons for Earth system law? And thank you so much, Louis, for all your comments, not only on the content of the chapter, but on the tone as well. And some of the conversation that we had was the original draft was perhaps a little bit too Iron Maiden. And while I didn't have to go, these are Louis' words, quote unquote, I didn't have to go full Diana Krall, through a lot of intellectual groundwork and emotional soul searching, we agreed that Bon Jovi was probably an appropriate tone for this particular volume. And so the remainder of what I'm about to say is a corruption, cooptation of Bon Jovi lyrics in a medley to represent my chapter. And it goes like this. Shot through the heart and you're to blame. Neoliberalism gives sustainable development a bad name. We play our parts while you play your game, darling. Neoliberalism gives sustainable development a bad name. And I said it's a medley, so moving into Bon Jovi's pop rock ballady era. I can't lay you down on a bed of roses, for the earth we sleep is a bed of nails. And in conclusion, sing along if you know the words. This ain't a song for the broken-hearted. No silent prayer for faith departed. I ain't gonna be just a crowd, gonna hear my voice out loud. It's our multi-species lives. It's now or never. Do you want the Earth system to live forever? If so, we're gonna have to change how most of us live our lives. It's our multi-species lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I promised you that this is going to be an exciting book, and certainly it is chapters like the one from Michelle that also sort of really elevates the excitement and the novelty and the approach. And my sort of takeaway when I engaged first with some of the first versions of your work generally, Michelle, but also for this book specifically, is I think what we all share, if I may speak on everyone's behalf, as a general observation, is a sort of a sense of the urgency that something really needs to be done. I also think we share a passion for trying to, if not come up with solutions, but make a contribution that leads to formulating these solutions. And this is what inspires me. This is what I think collectively inspires us all. And thank you for the enthusiasm. Thank you for the innovation. Thank you for being so massively creative in helping us to push the boundaries, because this is what we need to do. Is we need to be radical. We need to push the boundaries. This is ultimately important for the context that we live in. Thank you very much, Michelle. And by the way, congratulations again also on your editor-in-chiefship of Resil, the massively important journal, of course, that Michelle is co-leading. Wonderful journal to publish in, and we all, we are all looking forward to continue working with you, of course, on the journal as well. So now over to Rosalind Warner, who will speak about something that both Ivan and Jeff have also already touched upon, kinship, and also a wonderfully rich chapter that really makes a case for thinking about kinship as a possible metaphor or principle for Earth system law. Rosalind, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the conveners for bringing us all together to talk about this really important topic. And in the spirit of Canadian Thanksgiving, I would like to also thank the Indigenous peoples of the Silks Okanagan, whose valley I live, work, and play in. So really privileged and happy to be a part of this project and reading the abstracts of the other papers. I just think this is such amazing work. A little bit about my chapter. So it's about kinship as a metaphor for Earth system law and governance. And as an overview, simply what I'm arguing here is that we're looking at the role of metaphors in international environmental law as it prevails, but also looking at how kinship metaphors operate both within the law today and how they might operate in the future. So I'm arguing here that in contrast to prevailing legal metaphors like property, even the ideas of a public trust and personhood, kinship metaphors as an alternative promotes a notion of community, a shared responsibility, the subjectivity of nature, and intergenerational ethics. So I start off by situating kinship as a metaphor within the context of legal pluralism and talking about a little bit about how the prevailing metaphors kind of fall short and create certain gaps in the law that allow for international environmental law that allow for interpretations that actually undermine the purposes of environmental law, which ultimately is protection of the environment. And so what I want to argue is that we want to find a way to, within Earth system law, to realign legal principles with the urgent needs of the current planetary crisis, which is pointing out to us pretty much on a daily basis. It's, as to use Michelle Lim's words, enshittification. Why should we pay attention to metaphors and their use in Earth system law? Well, I want to thank Louis for his comments and really getting me to think about why metaphors are important and how discourse is important to our understanding of law. And I do believe that metaphors can be an instrument of understanding. So it can be a way of helping us to communicate better what the legal principles are, what their basis is. It's also kind of the way that we think about things. Metaphors are everywhere. They're in our language, they're in our way of thinking. They can oversimplify, no doubt about it, but they're also extremely important to communicating meaning. So two things came to mind, again, not the only things that we could think about, but metaphors can be a way of bridging disciplines. So for example, Earth system law is not just about law, it's not just about science or economics, social issues, but it's a way of bridging across those different disciplines. And so it can create a common language. So using a metaphor can help us to at least talk about concepts in a way that translates their meaning between disciplines. But another important role for metaphors, I think, can be actually transforming and reframing issues, creating things in novel ways, and asking us to think about things in terms of creative problem solving, thinking about innovative approaches, coming up with new legal frameworks. So metaphorical thinking is a way of imagining things differently, as well as a way of communicating across our communities. So a couple of examples, there have been a couple of books written recently that liken climate action to warfare. So warfare is a metaphor that's used in a lot of other contexts as well. You know, we've all heard like all is fair in love and war. What does war mean as a metaphor? Well, to us, it signifies certain images of strategy and tactics and planning and social organization. I think it's a gendered concept in many ways. And so when we think about climate action in terms of warfare, it brings to mind different aspects of the problem, and it might hide other certain aspects of the problem. Not necessarily saying it's the wrong way to think about climate action, but it does frame things. It leaves in the sense of adding things in and leaving things out. Another alternative metaphor for climate action might be building a house. So creating a place in which we can live comfortably, in which we can raise families, in which we can create a permanent abode, in which we can consider ourselves as having a home base, as a part of a community. So, and also working together as building and constructing something that is going to have permanence. So this is just an example. I think there's probably many other examples that you and I can all think of how metaphors work in our everyday lives, but also work in legal language. And metaphors are used in existing law. So we already think of a lot of to use the terminology of principles, right? We already think in terms of metaphors when we think about those principles. We always find ways to relate our thinking to things that we know or things that are generally shared. So for example, property is actually a metaphor. I think it draws a lot from rights language. So property is actually a definition of a series of rights that someone has over nature. But property also embeds within it the idea that nature is an extension of humans or an instrument of humans within a defined and narrow purpose. So property exists for a particular purpose. And in that sense, then nature kind of has the same mechanical properties as a clock. And if you look at the early writings on nature as a clock coming out of the Renaissance, this was very much, I would argue, connected with the idea of the extension of human achievement to nature. In the introductory chapter to the book, there's a discussion of Gaia. Gaia is also a metaphor in which the planet is like a living biological embodied organism. So it's a biological metaphor. So where property, or alternatively the clock, can be thought of as a mechanical metaphor, Gaia is a biological metaphor. And thirdly, harmony with nature is something that we see, including in the Pact for the Future, which is similar to Gaia in the sense that it is, thinks of the planet as a whole in a sense, but I would argue it's more of an aesthetic metaphor. So it suggests a set of relationships that are more than some of their parts, that are dynamic, that are progressive, and that are united and mutually reinforcing in the same way that notes are in a musical score. So that brings me to a kinship metaphor. And what would a kinship metaphor mean? What are the associated meanings that we would see with that? So I would argue it's an ethical metaphor. So it's not necessarily like a biological one. It's not necessarily a mechanical one. It's quite different from that. And it activates a sense of affinity with nature. So a warmth, of kind of a familiarity. So we kind of can understand kinship and the relationships of kinship in a really almost a universal way. I'm not saying that kinship is the same everywhere, or that there aren't different cultural interpretations of it. But when we look at it as a metaphor for law, we can think of it as a relationship of mutual rights and responsibilities. So in every kind of law that you can think of, considering even family law, it's mainly about what are the rights and responsibilities of a family member to another family member. What makes kinship different, I think, is that it's in the context of a common origin and a common fate. So the sense that humans in nature have the same origin. We have the same evolutionary background. We have the same fate. We are all together on this planet. And thirdly, it's a collective and stable identity. I think, interestingly, there's some linkages to be made between metaphor and identity. So when we think of nature as family, relative, brother, sister, mother, father, or uncle, aunt, we are also situating ourselves as an identity, as humans. I'm often drawn to, I've done some work on orcas recently, and the indigenous understanding of orcas as relatives under the waves. So sentient, and but also an ethical relationship that's quite different from the way that international environmental law currently casts our relationship with nature. What does it mean for Earth system law? I focus on two main features of a kinship metaphor that might advance that transformative potential of Earth system law. The intergenerational ethic of kinship, I think, is important. So this sense of common origins and a common fate, it precludes instrumentalism as a core modus operandi. So it speaks to intrinsic value in a way that prevailing law does not. Generations of families are part of a single continuous community with mutual rights and obligations to each other. So again, very much about the obligations that we have towards both future generations and also to draw on the knowledge of the past. For legal principles of subjectivity, it's a specific form of legal subjectivity. So I think we can imagine that there are different kinds of legal subjectivity beyond simply saying subject or an object. It emphasizes the community basis of law. Currently, subjectivity as it's understood in Western law is quite individualistic. And so this is something I develop in the paper. So there's a sense of a community subjectivity. And to give a nod to recent ecological science that views ecosystems as alive. So similar to Gaia, a kinship metaphor also picks up on the notion of nature as alive. So just to summarize, the things that a kinship metaphor allows for that perhaps is not allowed for in our current prevailing understanding of law is a legal subjectivity for nature, a moral agency for nature, an intergenerational ethic, and the solidification of the intrinsic value of nature. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. And this is my email if you'd like to get in touch with me. Looking forward to hearing more from you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ross. Thank you so much for this inspiring presentation. And again, we can all read more about the specific details when we get the chapter. I know that we're a bit pressed for time, so I am going to hand over immediately to Mike Angstad, for presentation of your chapter. Mike, please, floor is yours.
Yes, hello, thank you so much. Coming to you from Colorado College on the traditional unceded lands of the Ute, Kiowa, Arapaho, Comanche, and Cheyenne. And I'm really grateful to be with you today. I'm really mindful of our limited time, so I just wanted to briefly thank you for the opportunity to co-convene this task force to carry forward the great work of Rek, Louis, Ishik, Catherine Blanchard, and others, and just so grateful for this community. I wanted to very briefly also provide an overview of my chapter in this edited volume. It draws on my work, which really explores the role of domestic courts, judges, and institutions in shaping international and transnational environmental law. I explore their potential to support a transition to an Earth system law, and the prospect of attuning these sites of governance to more systemic considerations. And so this is exactly what my chapter explores, and it foregrounds these institutional dimensions of an emergent Earth system law. I try to think about the ways that we might connect our present institutions to something that might more closely approximate the ideals that we're beginning to articulate in this Earth system law discourse. And I really focus on the interstitial space of how we develop the transformative pathways to get us from here to those ideals. I think my chapter offers both an optimistic assessment of the potential for domestic courts and related institutions in this space, but also some caution about the potential of institutional innovations to provide half measures or practices that can reify inequities in the name of incremental progress. And so I try to unpack this by exploring a few case studies that we're seeing in some different domestic contexts. And so just to briefly highlight a few of these examples, I explore recent efforts by domestic courts to recognize the interests of future generations and more than human interests as evidence of at least the potential of domestic courts to expand their cognizance and how they account for environmental challenges in perhaps more systemic character. Second, I look to an example close to my home here in Colorado, a system of specialist water courts that actually defines its geographic jurisdiction by the contours of the river basins themselves, rather than the political jurisdictions that are mapped onto those spaces, as evidence that, at least in theory, we might reimagine geographic jurisdiction to better align with more systemic environmental demarcations. And then third, I look at the emergence globally of environmental courts and tribunals as evidence that we might equip courts with subject matter attributes that could better reflect the systemic challenges of Earth system law. And so collectively, I explore how emphasizing and supporting these developments could be valuable alongside efforts to more fundamentally and theoretically reimagine our institutions. So my chapter thinks a bit about how we could think about this theory to practice trajectory by considering how we socialize the people who come to practice in domestic courts by reimagining environmental law curricula, but at the same time really advocating this deep theoretical imagination undertaken by Earth system lawyers. I'm really excited about my chapter, really eager to say more, but again, really sensitive to time. So I think I'll stop here, and thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
Thank you so very much, Mike. And I think the sense really is also just listening to you, and I've had the privilege, of course, of reading the chapter a couple of times, is the wonderful, rich array of topics that the volume seeks to cover from so many different perspectives, and the expertise that we each bring to the table. And you certainly also, Mike, with your focus on the role of courts, really very much appreciated. And thank you also for joining the co-convening team of the task force. We are immensely grateful and humbled to have you on the team, and looking forward to working with you. And now, last but certainly not least, someone whose work I am massively interested in and inspired by, certainly in the climate domain, is our wonderful friend and dear colleague, Benoit Meyer. Benoit, I'm happy to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. So I won't be long because we don't have much time, but so this chapter was really aimed at, so at first I'm new to the Earth System Law Club. I think that's, the book contains, includes people who have been there for some time and people like me who are really newcomers. And when I approached this, first in the workshop post-COVID, the first workshop post-COVID, first time I went out of Hong Kong for years, I asked myself some questions about the reason why we were doing this kind of scholarship about what the law ought to be. And I kept thinking, what is the added value of a lawyer, of a legal scholar looking at this kind of question, as opposed to, moral philosophers looking at what we ought to do, and international relations scholars or political science scholars who can think about what can realistically be achieved with our means. I think legal scholars can, of course, engage in interdisciplinary research. I mean, as long as we are aware of, the existence of other disciplines, and we don't try to reinvent the wheel. But we have to be aware of the kind of undertaking we are doing. But the second question I had when approaching this project was, who is the audience? Who are we talking to? And I think that's quite related. Are we just talking between ourselves? And in that sense, I don't think this is, I don't think that should be the case. I see scholarship as being something hopefully useful to society. And if we are just talking to ourselves, then there is a risk of preaching the converted, because I think everyone here agrees that we need to do more to reduce the impact we have on the environment. So I understand that this scholarship must be understood as a transformative project, a project that is aimed at changing things. But to change things, I think that's Antoine de Saint-Exupéry wrote, a wish without a plan is, sorry, a goal without a plan is just a wish. So we need to have some kind of plan. And I found that a lot of the scholarship on Earth system law is about what ought to be achieved or what we should try to achieve, but not about how do we get there. And that's really what I was interested in here. And I was looking at a particular aspect, which is who is going to act to get this law and adopted, implemented, and enforced. So my chapter is entitled "The Earth System Law Makers." So I look at who will be making the Earth System Law. So who is deciding, basically? And I approached this, I realized there was a tension between two different kind of ground for legitimacy in making the law, a scientific legitimacy and a democratic legitimacy. I think there is a call for objectivity, calling to science, calling to some kind of international, supranational, super authority to make the law. And on the other hand, there is, a falling down on, it has to be a democratic lawmaking. And as a caveat, I'm not giving any answers here. I'm just asking questions. So in the chapter has three main sections that look at three types of authorities. I think are the three most likely Earth system law makers. The first one is scientific institutions. The second and third one are the global and national institutions. So with regard to the scientific institutions, I think they have a role to play, obviously. I'm not here questioning the climate science or any kind of science. I think there are scientific findings, by which I mean hard science, and to a large extent also soft science, are really important. They tell us something. We will not know about climate change without science, not in the same way at least. So we need to take into account the science. What I'm asking here is whether we can rely on scientists to tell us what the law ought to be. The Copenhagen Accord in 2009 wrote, and I quote, recognizing the scientific view that the increase in global temperature should be below 2 degrees Celsius. So this is suggesting that the science can tell us what ought to be done. And I find it extremely problematic. Karl Popper explained that science is a method to develop our knowledge of the world, our knowledge of what is, our knowledge of how the world operates. But it is not the same as ethical philosophy telling us what we should do about it. If we want to know what we should do, we have to have a normative reasoning, one premise of which has to be a normative premise. So we know that if we emit 1 more teraton of CO2, the world will have a much more climate change. And it is because we care about it that we decide we don't want it. But there is this normative premise, and we cannot just deny the existence of a normative premise, that what we care about, what the value are. So science alone cannot tell us what ought to be done. And I think even for a question like climate change, obviously, 4 or 3 degrees of global warming, or even probably 2.5, are, a no-go. I guess no one reasonably will look at the science and tell you it's okay. But then saying like 1.5 or 2 degree, I think there is to some extent some question which is not objective. It's a matter of subjectivity, how much you care about nature as opposed to just your own survival, how much you care about people in other countries, how much you care about future generations. I personally think there are right and wrong answers, but they are not true and false answers. So it is not an objectivity question. It's not something that science can answer. It is something that science can inform, but not decide. So the second type and the third type of institutions, the global and national kind of political institutions, help to approach some of those questions. And I'm going to go very quick on this. At the global level, I think there is a lot of belief that if we rely more on international institutions, then we are going to have a better law. But we have to be careful with that. The fact is that international institutions are not democratic at all, even less than some countries at least. And there might be an inherent value in conserving some kind of civilizational diversity, having different types of legal political regimes in different places. So global institutions are probably part of what should be acting in making a system law become real, but it's probably not the entire thing. I think we cannot deny that national institutions must also have a role. The main argument in favor of the state is that sometimes national governments are legitimate and democratic. After living in 8 years in Hong Kong, I really underscore the word sometimes. But then let's actually raise the issue of what if national government, democratic government like Switzerland votes against climate action? And what if you have this clash between what is clearly needed, what global institutions are telling, what science is kind of suggesting ought to be done based on reasonable assumptions, normative assumptions, and what the people is voting for? So again, I'm not providing any answer. I warned you about that. I think my conclusion is that we need all three. We need a combination of science, global institutions, and national institutions. All of them have a role. None of them can take over any of the others. They have to be combined. How they have to be combined is something I cannot answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very clearly, not only the famous climate litigation and climate law expert that you are very well known for, but also very able and willing to branch out into sort of new other explorations such as Earth system law. Thank you very much for these extremely thought-provoking ideas. Again, I've had the benefit of reading the chapter, and I can tell you it's really, really, really good stuff. I am afraid that we have sort of reached the end of our session. And I am, on the one hand, we will unfortunately not have time for a Q&A as such, but I am extremely happy that we had this time and opportunity to be able to share sort of a appetizer, if you want to call it that, with a broader audience. This has also been recorded and will be made available later on for people to see. And I'm sure that we were able, within the limited time that we had, to sort of give a broad overview of what it is that we are all individually working on, but also together within this collaborative project. And again, we are working towards publishing the book very, very soon. And we will also have a launch event where we will hopefully have also a bit more time for longer, more thorough engagement also with other participants. I do want to thank every one of you who have been here today. I do want to thank every one of you who are contributing to this project. I know it's a lot of time. I know it is sort of this unselfish work that one does on the side. So thank you very much for that. Hope we can all reciprocate for all the effort that everyone's taking. And if there are any specific questions that you have to any one of the participants, please feel free to email it to me specifically, and I'm very happy to connect you with all or any of the contributors who have spoken today and who will contribute to the book. So thank you extremely much again for all of your wonderful, rich contributions, and looking forward to finalizing this with everyone and to our collective work as a task force. Thank you very, very much, and have a splendid day wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.